Hi, I'm Duncan Moss, and I'd like to welcome you to my latest video blog. Today I'll be talking about another science fiction author, that's H.G. Wells. And along with Jules Verne, I think they're known by many people as the grandfathers of science fiction. I hope you enjoy what I have to say. Um, I had a problem with the Jules Verne one that I did, which is still on the blog. I have attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which means sometimes part of that means that I look at my notes to get the things I need, and they're there right in front of me, but I can't actually see them. My brain doesn't pick them up for some strange reason, and that happened with the Jules Verne for a little bit. Um, but I recovered just. But no, I read my first H.G. Wells book when I was 11, and that was War of the Worlds, which I enjoyed tremendously. I'll be talking about that in a short while. Herbert George Wells, known as a child by his parents as Bertie, I think, was born in 1866 in Bromley, Kent. He came from a very humble, lower middle class background. The family were often very, very hard up. So his education was a little bit sporadic. When he was about, I think, 14, his parents put him and I think his brother, one of his brothers, into an apprenticeship as a draper, as assistant, which he absolutely hated. But it inspired him to write two non-science fiction works, Kips and The History of Mr. Polly, which was sort of social reflections on on society, his sort of society as he and his contemporaries saw it. And he was able to continue his education, and part of that was he became a member of staff at a school, which I think it was Midhurst Grammar, where he was, I think it's called a pupil teacher, whereby you could do your own studying, and you could teach younger children who were very at the bottom of the school, quite young, and get paid for it or get your allowance or whatever, and be free to be able to learn yourself. And that's what he took full advantage of. He basically excelled in Latin and science, and eventually he would go on to get himself as he got a scholarship at the Normal School of Science, and he came out with a Bachelor of Science degree in biology. One of the pupils he taught was A. Milne. At Henley House School, where but all his when he did do this teaching, it didn't last for very long. He seemed to be very interested in loads of things. His first publication was a 2-volume biology textbook. He was a scientist. He would write, I think his first actual book of stories, actual fiction, was a book of short stories in 1895, followed very, very closely by his science fiction classic, The Time Machine, which was made into a film 65 years later, produced by George Powell and starring Rod Taylor. And of course, they take full advantage of the 65 years that have happened, where the film is set in 1895, as the book is, in Richmond, Surrey. They are able to add a little bit more to the story, because we got a little bit more. We know a little bit more about what happened. It's a great story. I don't want to say anything that's going to spoil it for anybody, but do. It's a wonderful book to start reading H.G. Wells because, and it's not very long. It's not a novel really. It's a novella, which is a cross between a short story and a novel. And following very soon after that, there was The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, The Invisible Man in 1897. Where H.G. Wells wrote to a friend and said, of course, that if there was an invisible man in real life, he'd have a rather difficult handicap. He'd be blind unless they could do something about sort it out. He would be blind. In 1898, we had War of the Worlds about Martians attacking Earth and landing in Woking, of all places, and constructing, once they've landed, Martian tripod attack machines that come out of the sandpit in, I think it's in, is it Horsell? No, sorry, it's a part of Woking. Anyway, there's a big sandpit and it's still there, and the Martians come out and start laying waste to the area. And basically, H.G. Wells, he was finally left. He was a socialist, and he despised the British colonialism. And basically, what he's doing is he's attacking colonialism by using a science fiction backdrop. Remember that this is 1898. Man still hadn't achieved powered flight. The Wright brothers would do that 5 years later. So we've got a story about Martians attacking the Earth, coming from outer space, and it's a very fine story. What tends to happen in these stories now? Jules Verne, who tended to have peak characters who go off on adventures geographically, go hundreds of miles to find adventure. H.G. Wells's heroes tend to be middle of the road people who are leading very, very routine lives, and then suddenly the trouble comes to them. There was also The First Men in the Moon, and The Food of the Gods, The War in the Air, When the Sleeper Awakes. And that was in 1910. And they weren't called science fiction at the time. They were called scientific romances. And those, a lot of H.G. Wells' short stories, many of them were science fiction, would be featured in magazines, like pulp magazines like Astounding Stories into the 20s and the 30s. Where he would rub shoulders with such writers as John Bainham Harris, or John Maynan, who was basically a very young John Wyndham, who would, H.G. Wells was his hero. Basically, H.G. Wells was very unhappy with most of the film versions of his stories that he saw during his lifetime. There was only one that he liked, and that was R.C. Sherriff's adaptation of The Invisible Man, which was filmed in Hollywood, that starred Claude Rains. Well, it actually brought Claude Rains to stardom. And he really liked that, but that's the only one he liked. What he did was he wrote a screenplay for himself. In 1933, I think it was, he wrote a book called The Shape of Things to Come. He'd previously done an outline of history which had basically an outline of world history from the caves up to the present day, using it with 20 authors to help him. And after that book had been published, he decided to try and map out the next 180 years, calling it The Shape of Things to Come. The story didn't have any any characters in it. It was just an outline of development of the human civilization over those 180 years. But he wrote a story, a film script called Things to Come, which is derived from Shape of Things to Come. But that did have story, have characters in it, and it was produced by Alexander Korda and directed by William Cameron Menzies. Who would 20 years later direct the film the very creepy Invaders from Mars. Well, this movie that was shot, I think, down in the West Country with the most incredible sets was not a box office success, but it is one of the most incredible films ever made. Basically, it has London being bombed and of course, 4 years later, the film was made in 1936. 4 years later, of course, that would be happening in reality. It stars Daniel Massey and Sir Ralph Richardson, and it really is an incredible movie. If you haven't seen it, treat yourself. It wasn't a box office success, but it's worth seeing. There's nothing like it anywhere you go. And I think it was basically the 2001 A Space Odyssey of its day. He also wrote a script for The Man Who Could Work Miracles, and that was made into a film. He wrote another script, I can't remember what it was, but which was never made. And there was a lot. His work was very, very greatly respected, and he is one of the finest authors Britain has ever produced. In 1930, I think it was 1937 or 38, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theatre did a radio adaptation of War of the Worlds on radio, updating it to the present day, which was 1938, and having the story being told through a broadcaster who's broadcasting live when the Martians attack. And despite the fact they did put out claimers saying this is Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre performing War of the Worlds based on the novel by H.G. Wells, a lot of people tuned in after one of those disclaimers. And within about 10 minutes, they really did think that the Martians were attacking, and it caused massive panic across America. It also caused some panic in Britain, because some people were listening on shortwave. And I suppose now in our day and age, we laugh at something like that. But you've got to remember, this was the time of the Depression. A lot of people were living hand-to-mouth existences. And, fear is a strange thing. And there was even, because he mentions a place, something Mill, I think, in the story, the people who really lived there thought were preparing with guns to go out and fight the Martians. And one person very sadly committed suicide with this. And H.G. Wells visited America in 1940, and on KTSA radio in San Antonio, Texas, H.G. Wells had the privilege of interviewing Orson Welles and asking him questions about his film Citizen Kane, but also they did dwell on War of the Worlds, and H.G. Wells apparently thanked him for the increase in book sales of, said, one of my more obscure works. I think he was trying to be funny. But so many of H.G. Wells' stories have been made into films. Now, he hated the 1932 film The Island of Lost Souls with Charles Laughton, which was based on his novel The Island of Dr. Moreau. He was very unhappy that Charles Laughton was playing him as a mad scientist, because in the book, he's not like that at all. He's a very decent man who really is really sincerely trying to do something that will benefit mankind. Of course, it goes very, very wrong. And I'm sure that Nigel Neal, when he came up with the Quatermass, Professor Bernard Quatermass, and the Quatermass experiment, I think he must very much have had some inspiration from the Island of Dr. Moreau and H.G. Wells. And there's the Time Machine film, which I've already spoken about, which Rod Taylor, which was Wells died in 1946. The film was made in 1960, so that's only 14 years after Wells has died. It's a great movie, and quite a lot of differences from the book, but and here I've got some figures of the Morlocks from the film. They seem to have said that there are three types. First of all, I thought they were all pretty much the same, all equally as horrible. But those I picked up a few years ago. It's amazing. I haven't got a model of the Time Machine from the film, which is a shame, but I've got a very nice edition of the Time Machine. This is from Pan Books. This is published quite a long time ago. This edition came out. I've got several versions of it. And then I've got an edition of The Invisible Man. This is from Everyman. It's very, very nice. And When the Sleeper Wakes, which was set 200 years in the future. And I think Woody Allen based his film Sleeper very loosely on this. A brave book. And Wells predicts that we're going to have shopping precincts with lifts going up into the sky and things. And you look at some of the shopping malls that we have today, and he wasn't far off the mark. This is the shape of things to come. Now, Wells's writing career went on for over 50 years. I think his last novel was All Aboard for Ararat, which I don't know much about at all. And to my shame, I have never read any of his non-science fiction works, which I really must do something about. He was friends with Jules Verne. I think I mentioned that in the Jules Verne blog that I did. And of course, their writing of both of them spans from 1895 to Verne's death in 1905. But they used to write to each other. I don't think they ever met. He supported the League of Nations, but he was very disillusioned that the League of Nations were unable to stop the Second World War from breaking out. And despite the fact he predicted it in in things to come, he was people think he was optimistic. He wasn't. He tried Christianity out, but decided basically to reject it. And in 1945, he wrote his last book, and a social reflection on society, on mankind, called "Man at the End of His Tether." And he was basically saying that at the end, he said that at the end, he suggested it might not be a bad idea for mankind to be replaced by another species. Oh dear. One of the nice things about it is that there has been, from a very fine science fiction author called Stephen Baxter, who's written works of his own, wrote a sequel to The Time Machine called The Time Ships, which has won several awards, and it's a super adventure story. And got lots and lots of wonderful plot twists. People said it's actually better than The Time Machine. Well, I don't think you can say it's better than The Time Machine, because if it hadn't been for The Time Machine, the time ships would never have been written. But it is a super book, and I'm not going to spoil it by giving out any spoilers. But if you haven't read the Time Machine first, and then read the Time Ships, I don't think you'll be disappointed. And he also wrote a sequel to the War of the Worlds called The Massacre of Mankind. Both these sequels were endorsed by H.G. Wells' estate, and of course, I said that I felt that Quatermass, Professor Bernard Quatermass, was influenced by H.G. Wells. Doctor Who, which first broadcast in 1963. And that was only just over 17 years after H.G. Wells had died. Very, very strongly influenced by H.G. Wells. And in fact, they even have an actor playing H.G. Wells as a young man in one of the Peter Davison adventures, which, forgive me, I cannot recall the name of. But had H.G. Wells lived long, say 20 or 30 years longer, I am absolutely certain that he would have loved Doctor Who, and that he'd be knocking down the front door of the BBC broadcasting house to offer his services as a script writer for the programme. So his influence in science fiction continues to inspire writers today. He died in 1946, sadly, only after, sadly 6 weeks before his 80th birthday. And I think this is one of my dad's books. This is Love and Mr. Lewisham. Ashamed to say I don't know much about it. I think it's a short story, and I think you get other stories with it. And this was part of a load of books that came out to celebrate H.G. Wells' 80th birthday, which sadly he didn't see. But nevertheless, they still went out and published the books. And I think that basically that's all I have to say. Oh, he was a member of the Fabian Society. And when he was at school, he did do debating. He liked it. He had a dislike to the author Hilaire Belloc, who was also a fellow Fabian. And he tried to outmaneuver Hilaire Belloc on several occasions in debates. But Hilaire Belloc was a much better debatist than he was. Or debater? Anyhow, and it used to get Wells so upset and stressed out, because he really wanted to wanted one-upmanship with Hilaire Belloc. I don't think did anything to him to cause problems. I also know he had his own car. Apparently was a lousy driver, from what I can gather. And he was inspired very, very much by, but he was inspired by, his mother worked as a housekeeper in a very rich family, had a massive library. And H.G. Wells was allowed to come and stay with his mum. And they had a massive library, which he was allowed to look at, go around and take books and read them. And he read Plato's Republic and Sir Thomas More's Utopia, and several novels by Daniel Defoe, who, again, was a great, inspired Jules Verne as well. And he was also apparently greatly inspired by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's another book I've got here, which I hadn't heard of. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, called Valley of the Spiders. And that has, actually it's got a few other stories with it. So it's a short story, and I think Love and Mr. Lewisham is a full novel. As I say, he's this isn't to tell you the whole story of H.G. Wells. It's just to whet your appetite and to go and enjoy them. His heroes they're quite brave in their own way. They have to deal with things that they never thought they'd ever have to deal with. And of course, one of the things that's happened in recent years, we've had several versions of War of the Worlds. The best being the George Powell version in 1953, which again, like the Wells radio broadcast, is set updated to modern day America, but it's still a fantastic picture. One day I hope very much that someone in the cinema, in the film industry, will make a very good high budget version of the story set in 1897. We've had a few done. They've been done with CGI, and they've been brave efforts considering their budget limitations. But I think it'd be lovely to see. And then who knows? We have a sequel to it. I wasn't crazy about the Steven Spielberg version with Tom Cruise, but then it was a brave. Again, it was a brave effort. And I would strongly advise and encourage you to discover H.G. Wells in your own way. And if you enjoyed this blog, then please subscribe to my video channel and click the like button. And I'll see you all around fairly soon. Thank you very much. God bless.